Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. U.S. Census data came out last Thursday, which started new efforts in redistricting boundaries in Utah. Last week, we talked to leaders of the groups in charge of the redistricting, but tonight we want to talk to some groups who are watching the process closely, discuss what they're looking for, and how they are working to get Utahns involved in the process. Joining us now are Laura Lewis AE, Utah Legislative Committee member from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, TJ Ellerbeck, Executive Director of the Rural Utah Project, and via Zoom, Katie Matheson, Deputy Director of Alliance for a Better Utah. Thank you all for being here tonight. This first question will be directed to all three of you. We'd like to have you each start talking about why redistricting is important to your organization. We'll start with Laura first. Why is this of interest to you and your organization?
Thanks so much for having me on. So Mormon Women for Ethical Government, we are a nonpartisan organization, and redistricting is a really important issue to us because voting rights is one of the 5 key areas of focus of our advocacy work. One of the principles of ethical government for our organization is that our democratic institutions and our electoral systems should maximize participation of and ensure equitable access for all of citizens of a society. And redistricting and the way that those boundaries are drawn largely ensures that.
And Katie, we will turn to you next. Why do you and Alliance for a Better Utah have an interest in the redistricting process?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So Alliance for a Better Utah is an accountability and advocacy organization. And so the foundation of all of our work is a system in which the people are represented, and it's the idea that people pick their leaders and not the other way around. Every single issue that we care about, and not just us as an organization, but a government that function, is built upon the idea that no matter your race, your background, your zip code, voters should pick their leaders, leaders shouldn't pick their voters.
TJ, let's turn to you now, the interest of you and Rural Utah Project.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rosie. The Rural Utah Project is a civic engagement organization that works to get people more involved in local government. And it's really hard to be involved and have your voice heard if you're not actually being represented, if you live in a district that is gerrymandered. And one recent example of this in Utah is San Juan County in southeastern Utah. This is the county where Bears Ears National Monument is and the Utah portion of the Navajo Nation. This county is an indigenous majority county, but until recently had a white majority on the county commission because the county commission districts were gerrymandered by racial lines. And in 2018, a federal court order required the county to draw new district boundaries, and for the first time ever, there was an indigenous majority elected to the county commission. And the new commission has made leaps and bounds in their effort to make government more accessible to people and increase the quality of life for people living in southern San Juan County.
And that is a very good example about why the general public should care about this process. Katie, what do you think about redistricting on a national level? What are you concerned about?
So our organization mostly focuses on the local level, but there are impacts on the national level that will impact all of us. For example, there was recently a report that came out that was pretty conclusive about climate change and how imminent the threat of climate change is. Basically, it says the next 30 years of climate weather that's increasing is going to continue. And for Utah, that looks like increased drought and increased extreme heat. And so when we talk about redistricting, it's not just a theoretical thing that happens behind closed doors. What it does is, like I said before, it's the foundation for who elects us. And far and away, people want climate change addressed by our elected officials. And so what this means is that issues like climate change, both on the local and the national level, require a districting process that is fair, that represents what the people want, and that can quickly address issues like climate change. We're seeing in states like in Texas and in Georgia, for example, the political power of the status quo is currently being challenged, at least in the past few elections. And so the people who have the power to draw maps in those states, they have some incentive to split communities in order to maintain their power, which ultimately is not good for policy that actually reflects what people want and helps communities go forward.
And Laura, let's hear from you. What are your thoughts when it comes to redistricting on a national level?
So I think one important principle that pertains on both a local and a national level is that gerrymandering weakens our democratic institutions by allowing our elected officials to choose their voters rather than the voters choosing their elected officials. And this can increase polarization, and it can also it really distorts representation. However, that being said, I am really proud of Utah because nationally we are one of only 11 states that voted to create an independent redistricting commission. This increases accountability, transparency, it strengthens our democracy and representation, equal representation of citizens. And so I think that by doing this, Utah really showed what their values are, and by getting involved in the process, we ensure that our legislators are held accountable and that these districts are drawn in a way that is most representable of the people that reside there.
Laura, TJ, and Katie, hold that thought. We do have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on citizen involvement in redistricting. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on citizen involvement in redistricting. We pick up now with our panel. Laura Lewis Agee from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, TJ Ellerbeck from the Rural Utah Project, and via Zoom, Katie Matheson from Alliance for a Better Utah. We'll start this question with Laura. We're turning now to the 4th Congressional District. It's the area with statewide interest. How are you thinking about how the map there should be divided, and what's important to your organization?
So, Rosie, as I mentioned, we are a nonpartisan organization, so I won't get into the politics of it, but I will say that in the most recent census that just came out recently, the 2020 census, it was revealed that West Valley City, which is part of the 4th Congressional District, just replaced Provo as the 3rd largest city in the state of Utah. And this is interesting because as we're drawing these maps and creating these districts, if we're doing it in a fair and representative way of the citizens, then those district maps should reflect those demographic and population changes to that area. So again, we want to create transparency, accountability, strengthen our democratic institutions. And one of the ways that we're doing this is through our independent redistricting commission and supporting them in their efforts with public input to inform our legislators in how they should draw these districts. And a lot of times these things happen, they can splice through different cities, through different communities of interest. And it's important that we keep those areas in mind and how those populations are changing so that we know the impact it has when we draw those districts.
Thank you, Laura. TJ, what about you? How are you thinking about the 4th Congressional District?
Well, if you look at the congressional district map in Utah, the current map, every single one of our 4 districts have both rural and urban pieces, including the 4th, which is the most urban but still includes a huge chunk of rural Utah. If you look at the 3rd Congressional District, San Juan County and the Navajo Nation are in the same district as Provo. And those are 2 places that have a totally different set of needs and requirements for a representative. And if you ask me, it just doesn't make sense that there's one person who represents both of those 2 really, really different communities. So 70% of Utahns or more live along the Wasatch Front. But those 70% of Utahns shouldn't be deciding who the representatives for all 4 of Utah's congressional districts are. It's really important that we address this urban-rural divide and that we draw maps that show that there are Utahns who live all over the state.
A definite interesting point that you bring up there, TJ. Katie, let's turn to you. How are you thinking about the 4th Congressional District?
Yeah, so it's unquestionable that the 4th Congressional District is currently gerrymandered. One of my favorite parlor tricks, which always gets a lot of oohs and ahs, as I'm sure you'll imagine as I tell you about it, is going to the 538 gerrymandering project. It's a website that anyone can go to, and you can see each state, and you can see their current congressional districts, and then how you can gerrymander each district. So if you wanted to gerrymander a district to favor Republicans, you can see a map that would do that. If you wanted to gerrymander a district to favor Democrats, you could do that. If you want to see a district that shows proportional representation based on voter registration, you can do that. And if you look at Utah's maps, our current maps and gerrymandered to favor Republicans are the same maps according to the 538 gerrymandering project. So there's no question what the current status is. The question is what we're going to do going forward. And instead of asking how we're looking at dividing the state, I would prefer to think about it is how we're uniting communities. So for example, in the 4th district, you have West Valley City, which was mentioned earlier. It's almost split in half. Half of it is in the 4th Congressional District, half of it in the Congressional District. Now, West Valley City recently was declared the first minority majority city in the state. And so what we've done 10 years ago is we split what is now a minority majority city in half. And so we're diluting that representation. So we don't want to be splitting cities where communities live. We want to be keeping people together because ultimately that strengthens their voices and results in making sure that they can get the resources that they need. And these resources include things like hospitals and roads and schools. It's that close to home. Now, we like to talk about the 4th Congressional District in Utah because that's where the drama is. It's the horse race for elections. But you know, to TJ's point, when we are adjusting the 4th district, we are also having to necessarily adjust other districts. So for example, you know, CD2, is it fair that St. George necessarily is combined with folks from the avenues in Salt Lake City? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves when we talk about what robust representation that results in resources we all share and need looks like.
TJ, can I have you chime in really quick to talk about what's happening in Moab?
Yeah, Moab's a really interesting case study in what our current state legislative districts look like. 10 years ago, in 2011, when the state legislature redrew the district maps the last time, they took Moab and decided to split it into 3 different state legislative districts. This is a town of about 5,000 people, and it's represented by 3 different state legislators, none of whom have ever lived in Moab. And this is one of the most important communities for Utah's economy and attracts tourists from all over the country and the world, and it has no representation at the state level in Utah, and that needs to change. It's a community that should be included together and given fair representation like everywhere else.
A lot of good food for thought coming from this discussion. Okay, TJ, Katie, and Laura, hold that thought. We have to take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on citizen involvement in redistricting. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on citizen involvement in redistricting. Before the break, we were joined by Laura Lewis-Agee from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, TJ Ellerbeck from the Rural Utah Project, and via Zoom, Katie Matheson from Alliance for a Better Utah. We pick up now right where we left off. Katie, let's start with you. We have an independent redistricting commission and a legislative redistricting committee. What are you going to be looking for as you watch how this process unfolds?
Well, ultimately, we have 2 processes happening side by side. We have the legislature and we have the independent redistricting commission. And at the end of the day, the people of Utah voted for the process that the Independent Redistricting Commission is bringing forward. So we think that given the standards that the commission is required to adhere to for their maps, given the process and given the way in which they came into being, we think that their process will ultimately result in the best maps for Utah. We hope ultimately that the legislature chooses to adopt one of the commission's maps. And instead of putting forward taking one of the commission's maps and adjusting it, because, when you have politicians who are creating these maps, what could happen is there's, they may want to protect themselves. There's a desire for incumbents to protect themselves, or, to maintain power in some way. So best case scenario for the voters of Utah is that the legislature adopts a commission map.
Laura, each of you are trying to get Utahns involved in this process. What are you and your organization doing to achieve this?
We're doing this through a combination of our education, advocacy, outreach. We are going to be doing a series of events in different areas of the state where volunteers of the Independent Redistricting Commission will come and educate us on the process and on citizen map making. We actually have one coming up this Friday from 11 to 1 at the Kearns Library. It's open to the public. We're also doing a service project with it for vest warmers from the homeless. Everyone is invited to come. We hope that through these efforts, we provide valuable input to the commission and therefore to our legislators, and that they'll listen to the voice of the people, and that ultimately we will have the best maps drawn in the interest of the people.
And even if you don't know anything about redistricting, go to one of these events and learn about it. Learn about why it matters as a member of the community. TJ, let's hear from you next. How is the Rural Utah Project working to get Utahns involved in this process?
Well, we, like Laura said, are also encouraging people to provide their feedback to the Utah Independent Redistricting Commission. We know the Independent Redistricting Commission is required to follow certain guidelines when they draw their maps, and one of those is keeping communities of interest together. So we're encouraging Utahns from all across the state to tell the commission what their community of interest is, which communities should be kept together and drawn into the same districts. And the commission is holding a series of public meetings all over the state and accepting feedback online. So it's really easy for people to be involved as long as they know that that opportunity exists.
Thank you, TJ. Katie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, when we talk about communities of interest or the process of redistricting, it can get confusing and convoluted, and there's a lot of big words that the average person doesn't have a lot of time to really dig into. You don't need to be an expert in redistricting to get involved. You just need to be an expert in your community. You can figure out how to talk about your community with the Independent Redistricting Commission. There's a tool, representable.org, where you can map your community, and your community is things like where everyone in your neighborhood goes to get medical care, where everyone in your neighborhood goes to school, where everyone goes to, congregate or go to the store. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about communities. So it doesn't have to be a high threshold of involvement. You don't need to have a lot of knowledge. You are the expert in your own community. And that's all we're asking is for people to get involved in that way and to talk about what makes your community your community.
Well said. Katie, we have about a minute left. I'm actually going to give this last question to Laura. Laura, final thoughts. What do you want Utahns to know, or what do you want to leave our viewers with tonight?
I am, like I said before, I'm so proud of Utah and for establishing and voting on this Independent Redistricting Commission. I think it shows the values of Utahns, and I think that by now that we've established it, we've put taxpayer dollars toward it, it's in our best interest to become involved and to give our input to the commission so that we can have the best maps to create the best representation for Utah citizens. And that's something that everyone can do, and I encourage everyone to do today.
TJ, anything you want to add? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add that this is really important, even if it's hard to see sometimes. These map boundaries are going to be what will determine every decision our state makes for the next 10 years until at least 2032. Every decision about funding for public education or road maintenance or infrastructure or protecting our air and water. These map districts will determine who makes those decisions, and it's important for Utahns to make sure their community is represented when those decisions are made.
All right, you've been hearing from Laura Lewis AE, Utah Legislative Committee member from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, TJ Ellerbeck, Executive Director of the Rural Utah Project, and via Zoom, Katie Matheson, Deputy Director of Alliance for a Better Utah. Thank you all for being on the show tonight to be part of this discussion.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thanks so much, Rosie.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by searching for ABC4 in Focus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.